Diplomacy by Henry Kissinger. The world of 2025 is rife with tension and uncertainty. From the devastated cities of eastern Ukraine, where artillery still echoes, to the streets of Gaza, where families seek shelter amid conflict, our era feels perilously unstable. Superpower rivalry simmers in the Taiwan Strait, and new alliances form from Washington to Beijing, from Brussels to Johannesburg. In the face of these challenges, we may wonder, how can we navigate such a volatile international landscape? One guide to answering this lies in the past, in the wisdom distilled by Henry Kissinger in his book, Diplomacy. Though published in 1994, Kissinger's sweeping history of international relations offers powerful insights into managing the dangers and opportunities of today's world. Kissinger, a veteran statesman and former US Secretary of State, famously described diplomacy as the art of restraining power. In practice, this means channeling the ambitions of nations into negotiation rather than war. Diplomacy chronicles centuries of statecraft, from the rise and fall of empires to the Cold War duel between superpowers, extracting lessons on how peace is made, preserved, or tragically lost. Now, in 2025, those lessons are more relevant than ever. This summary will explore Kissinger's core ideas thematically, weaving in current conflicts and power dynamics. We will journey through history's great diplomatic triumphs and failures, then apply their lessons to the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Gaza crisis, US-China tensions over Taiwan, the expanding BRICS coalition, and the shifting alliances of our time. Complex diplomatic concepts will be explained with real-world parallels and vivid analogies. Imagine international diplomacy as a grand chess game, a tightrope walk, or a balancing act on a global stage, the eternal dance of power and ideals. One of the first themes diplomacy addresses is the timeless tug-of-war between power and ideals in foreign policy. It's a drama as old as nations themselves. Should a country pursue its interests ruthlessly, or should it stand on principle and moral vision? Kissinger presents this as a contrast between Realpolitik, hard-nosed, interest-driven statecraft, and idealism crusading for values or ideological goals. Understanding this dichotomy is crucial to make sense of both history and current events. Imagine international relations as a pendulum swinging between two poles. On one end is realism, where nations act like players in a high-stakes chess match, focusing on survival, security, and advantage. At the other end is idealism, where nations act as missionaries, trying to reshape the world according to a set of universal principles, for example, spreading democracy or seeking world peace. Kissinger's historical tour shows how both approaches have shaped destinies. For instance, he contrasts two early 20th century US presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, a shrewd realist who saw foreign policy as a game of power, and Woodrow Wilson, an idealist who wanted to make the world safe for democracy and championed the League of Nations to end war for all time. Roosevelt was comfortable negotiating deals with imperial powers and balancing interests, while Wilson dreamed of a world governed by collective security and moral law. Why does this matter in 2025? Because today's leaders face the same fundamental choice. Consider the Russia-Ukraine war. On one hand, a realist might argue that great power interests and security concerns must be pragmatically addressed, for example, acknowledging Russia's desire for a buffer zone or Ukraine's strategic importance to the West to broker a peace deal and avoid an even larger war. A pure idealist, on the other hand, might insist that we cannot compromise on the principle that sovereign nations have the right to choose their own alliances and fate, and that aggression must be reversed entirely as a matter of justice. The tension between these views is palpable in debates over how to handle the conflict. Should Ukraine be encouraged to negotiate and perhaps cede some control in the east for a ceasefire, a cold calculation to save lives now? Or should the goal be to defeat aggression outright and restore every inch of territory on principle, a moral stand against rewarding expansionism? Kissinger's writings would urge careful consideration of interests and realities alongside ideals. He learned from history that pursuing lofty principles without regard to power realities can lead to disaster, just as ignoring moral values entirely can lead to unchecked aggression and instability. Analogies help illustrate this balance. We can think of global diplomacy like navigating a ship between rocky cliffs. One cliff is the hazard of cynical power politics. If we steer too close, we risk losing our moral compass and crashing on the rocks of war crimes or betrayal of values. The other cliff is the danger of naive idealism. Steering too close can wreck the ship on unrealistic expectations, ignoring real threats until it's too late. A skilled captain or diplomat must chart a middle course, avoiding both extremes. Kissinger repeatedly shows historical figures doing this delicate navigation. For example, during World War II, Winston Churchill talked about defending freedom, idealism, but also allied with Stalin's Soviet Union, hard realism, because Britain needed the brute force of the Red Army to survive Hitler. That marriage of convenience troubled Churchill's conscience, but ultimately it helped save democracy in Western Europe, a classic example of balancing ideals and interests. In the Cold War as well, American presidents had to juggle these impulses. The US framed its struggle against the Soviet Union as a moral crusade for freedom, yet it also made very pragmatic choices, like tolerating undemocratic allies if they were anti-communist, or striking arms control deals with Moscow that recognized an uneasy balance of power. Kissinger, being a key architect of some Cold War policies, famously practiced Realpolitik. He opened dialogue with Communist China and negotiated with North Vietnam, steps that moral purists saw as bargaining with tyrants, but which ultimately realigned global power and ended a war on terms the US could accept. The lesson for today is not that one approach is right and the other wrong, but that successful diplomacy often requires weaving together idealism and realism. We need guiding principles to inspire and legitimize actions, and we need pragmatic strategies to achieve them in the real world. Kissinger warns that clinging only to ideals can make a nation inflexible and blind to dangers, much like how Woodrow Wilson's lofty vision after World War I couldn't prevent the slide into World War II. At the same time, amoral realism without any values can turn foreign policy into a cynical chess game that breeds resentment and moral rot, as seen in some of the darkest episodes of the 20th century. In practical terms, a country like the United States in 2025 might promote democracy and human rights, idealism, but also must engage in hard bargains with rivals like China, or maintain partnerships with authoritarian states for the sake of stability and security, realism. European nations may cherish international law and norms, yet they find themselves ramping up military budgets and energy deals in a cold calculus to secure themselves amid war on their continent. Meanwhile, leaders like Russia's Vladimir Putin or China's Xi Jinping often speak the language of national interest and historical rights, Realpolitik, but also use ideological narratives. For instance, Putin's claim of protecting the Russian-speaking world or Xi's invocation of national rejuvenation to justify their moves. These mix power aims with ideas to rally support. To navigate this eternal dance, Kissinger's work suggests embracing pragmatic idealism, a mindset that neither cynically dismisses values nor naively ignores power. It means striving for a more peaceful, just world, but doing so with open eyes, understanding the ambitions, fears, and strengths of all players. The realist in a diplomat reminds them to assess the world as it is. The idealist reminds them of the world as it should be. When these two mindsets work in tandem, diplomacy has its best chance to succeed. The balance of power. Past Lessons for a Multipolar World. If there is one concept at the heart of Kissinger's diplomacy, it is the balance of power. Think of it as a giant set of scales on which the weight of nations is carefully adjusted so that no one side can dominate the rest. For centuries, this idea guided European diplomacy. After the devastating 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, and later the Concert of Europe, after 1815, established a system where major powers counterbalanced each other. The goal was not to end competition, but to keep it within bounds to prevent any single empire from completely overrunning the continent. This balance of power strategy was remarkably successful in the 19th century. Following the defeat of Napoleon, statesmen like Austria's Prince Metternich crafted an international order at the Congress of Vienna that gave all the big players, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, a stake in maintaining stability. For almost 100 years, there were no Europe-wide wars. Whenever a crisis arose, the great powers would convene and adjust their understandings rather than resort to all-out conflict. However, balancing power is a continuous and delicate task. It requires constant diplomatic effort to accommodate shifts in strength. By the late 19th century, a new factor disrupted the European equilibrium, the rise of a united Germany in 1871. Germany's unification under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck created a nation right in the center of Europe with tremendous population and industrial might, a potential hegemon if left unchecked. Bismarck himself understood the dangers and, after forging Germany through war, turned to peace. He built a web of alliances to reassure or restrain other powers, effectively keeping the balance. But after Bismarck's departure, German policy became less nimble. Rival blocs emerged. France bound itself with Russia. Germany grew closer to Austria-Hungary, and Britain later aligned with France and Russia. The balance of power turned into a rigid divide. When a spark came in 1914, the assassination of an Austrian archduke, this rigidity proved fatal. Alliances triggered like dominoes. Austria-Hungary went to war against Serbia, Russia mobilized against Austria-Hungary, Germany declared war on Russia and France, and so on, until World War I engulfed Europe. The lesson was stark. If the balance of power becomes inflexible, a minor crisis can explode into a massive war. What does this history teach us for today? We are effectively back in a world with multiple great powers, a multipolar world after a period of American predominance. The United States, China, Russia, the European Union, as a collective economic power, India and others all have significant weight. To avoid a great power war in our time, no single power or tight alliance should be allowed to attain absolute dominance, and each major player's core interests must be respected enough that they don't feel forced to lash out. In practical terms, that means all the big kids on the global block need to feel reasonably secure. If one perceives that its vital security is at risk, it may take drastic action that destabilizes everyone. Part of the tension leading up to the Ukraine war was precisely this. Russian leaders felt their security was threatened by NATO's eastward expansion, while NATO countries saw their own moves as shoring up a stable balance by deterring a historically aggressive Moscow. Clearly, perceptions of the balance differed wildly. Diplomacy's job is to bridge this gap, to find arrangements where Russia's legitimate security concerns, for example, not having hostile forces directly on its border, are weighed alongside the absolutely legitimate rights of countries like Ukraine to independence and safety. Achieving this is easier said than done, but it might involve creative compromises, limits on certain weapons deployments, agreements on military exercises, or new security pacts that give all sides reassurance. In Asia, the logic of balance of power is also crucial. As China has grown stronger and more assertive, other nations have responded. The US has strengthened defense cooperation with allies like Japan, Australia, and South Korea, and partnered with India and others through initiatives like the Quad to ensure China doesn't gain a free hand to dominate the Indo-Pacific. China, for its part, is expanding its military reach and seeking to push American influence farther from its borders. Smaller countries in Southeast Asia perform their own balancing act. They maintain good ties with Washington and Beijing, hoping to avoid being caught in an exclusive camp. It's a 21st century echo of the 19th century great power dance, but with more players and a truly global stage. And unlike in the 19th century, these powers span different cultures and political systems, making the task more complex. Kissinger, who was instrumental in the US opening to China in the 1970s, would likely advocate for some form of accommodation, not appeasement, but a clear-eyed agreement where both the US and China accept limits and understand each other's red lines to avoid a collision. In other words, rebalance the Pacific power equation through diplomacy so it doesn't tip into war over, say, Taiwan. One simple metaphor for keeping global peace through balance is tending a campfire. You have to arrange the logs, nations, so that the fire, competition, burns steadily but doesn't flare out of control. If one log is too large and dominates the fire, the flames, conflict, could rage too fiercely. If a log is removed entirely, the fire might collapse or spread unpredictably. Each major power is like a log that needs to be positioned just right. Historical diplomacy offers successful examples like the Concert of Europe of how to tend that fire wisely. It also offers cautionary tales like 1914 of how quickly things burn out of control when the balance fails. Ultimately, Kissinger's lesson is that an international order survives only when power is balanced enough that no one feels an existential threat, and when all major players see a benefit in maintaining the overall system. In 2025, achieving such a balance means big powers must show restraint and foresight. The United States and China must find ways to share influence without one trying to nullify the other. Europe, Russia, and emerging powers must create an environment where conflicts like Ukraine don't spiral further and where new rivalries, perhaps in cyberspace or the Arctic, are managed before they explode. It's a continuous process, a never-ending dance, but history indicates it's the surest path to peace in a multipolar world. Sovereignty under siege, the legacy of Westphalia and today's crises. Another foundational idea in diplomacy is the concept of national sovereignty, the right of a nation-state to govern itself without outside interference. This principle, formalized in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 after Europe's bloody wars of religion, has been the bedrock of international relations for centuries. Kissinger underscores how revolutionary it was. Instead of emperors or popes claiming universal authority, the world moved toward a patchwork of independent states, each sovereign within its borders. In essence, Westphalia said, "Your country is your business, and my country is my business." This laid the groundwork for modern diplomacy by establishing clear units, nation-states, that negotiate as equals, at least in theory, and respect each other's independence. Fast forward to 2025, and this principle of sovereignty is being tested in dramatic ways. Consider Ukraine, a sovereign nation recognized by the United Nations, suddenly invaded by a larger neighbor, Russia, which annexed parts of its territory by force. That is a direct assault on the Westphalian norm. It harks back to an older world where might made right when powerful empires routinely gobbled up weaker ones. The international community's strong reaction, sanctions on Russia, votes in the UN condemning the invasion, military support to Ukraine, is essentially a defense of the idea that borders cannot be changed by force and that people have the right to self-government. Kissinger's historical lens reminds us that whenever ambitious rulers in the past trampled on the sovereignty of others unchecked, whether it was Louis XIV of France overrunning parts of Europe, or Hitler annexing neighbors, the result was eventually a larger war to rebalance the system. Aggression unopposed becomes a wildfire. Thus, upholding sovereignty is not just a moral ideal, but a practical necessity to prevent endless conflict. However, reality is complicated. In some cases, the world has violated sovereignty for ostensibly higher principles. For example, Russia has justified its interventions in places like Ukraine by claiming to protect ethnic Russians or Russian speakers there, essentially using a twist on humanitarian reasoning to cover territorial ambition. This shows how sovereignty can conflict with other values like human rights or the principle of self-determination, the idea that peoples have the right to choose their own sovereign allegiance. Think of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. They seek an independent state of their own, a sovereign Palestine which remains unfulfilled. Their quest for self-determination clashes with Israel's sovereignty and security concerns. Decades of diplomatic efforts have tried to reconcile these, with partial successes and many setbacks. The recent Israel-Gaza war underscores how explosive the issue remains. To Palestinians and many in the Arab world, their lack of sovereign statehood is a glaring injustice. To Israelis, the creation of a Palestinian state must be balanced against ensuring Israel's own safety in a hostile region. Kissinger's era witnessed the Camp David Accords, where Egypt and Israel made peace a deal that involved Egypt regaining full sovereignty over Sinai and Israel, gaining recognition of its legitimacy from the Arab world's largest country. That shows sovereignty can be a bargaining chip. Territories were returned and wars ended when mutual recognition was achieved. A similar logic could be envisioned for Israel and Palestine. Two states for two peoples, each sovereign, but it requires huge trust and security guarantees, the kind of painstaking negotiation Kissinger specialized in. Until then, we see sovereignty under siege. Gaza's people living under blockade and bombardment, Israel's cities under rocket fire, a vicious cycle where neither side fully enjoys peace in their own land. Another modern quandary is in places like Taiwan. Taiwan functions as an independent sovereign entity in all but name, with its own democratic government and military. But China insists it is part of Chinese sovereignty and not a separate country, even threatening force to bring the island under Beijing's rule. This is a direct sovereignty dispute that could ignite war between great powers. The world largely tiptoes around it, maintaining a careful diplomatic fiction, the One China policy, where nations acknowledge China's claim but don't endorse it, and Taiwan isn't formally recognized as a separate state by most. This delicate dance is pure Kissingerian diplomacy. Recall that in the 1970s, Kissinger helped craft the Shanghai Communique, where the US acknowledged the Chinese position on Taiwan without abandoning its ally. It was ambiguity used as a tool of peace, essentially agreeing to disagree for the sake of stability. That formula has kept the peace for decades. But as China grows stronger and more nationalistic, and as Taiwan's people increasingly assert their separate identity, the old diplomatic compromise strains. The Taiwan issue in 2025 is a test of how far the world really respects sovereignty. Do Taiwan's 23 million people have the right to decide their own fate? Or will a great power's claim override it? How this is handled will either reaffirm Westphalian norms, if resolved peacefully, or shatter them, if force is used. In sum, the principle of sovereignty is a cornerstone that Kissinger's historical narrative defends. He would likely argue that stable diplomacy requires clarity about borders and mutual respect for statehood. At the same time, he was pragmatic. He knew that absolute sovereignty is sometimes tempered by reality. Small states often must mind the interests of big neighbors. Finland during the Cold War, for example, had constrained options in deference to the USSR, a condition sometimes dubbed Finlandization. The art is to do this without completely sacrificing independence. In today's world, reasserting the value of sovereignty might mean big powers recommitting to not invade or overthrow other governments, simply because they can a lesson painfully highlighted by not just Russia's actions, but also the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which Kissinger himself cautioned against. It also means supporting diplomatic solutions for stateless peoples and contested territories, recognizing that lasting peace comes when communities feel they have control over their own destiny. The world learned in 1648 that endless war over whose empire or religion should dominate was unsustainable. We may learn in this century that respecting each people's right to self-govern is equally indispensable to prevent chaos. Spheres of influence versus self-determination, a clash of principles. Closely tied to sovereignty is the tension between spheres of influence and the principle of self-determination. A sphere of influence is essentially a region where a great power insists on dominant sway, often claiming security needs or historical ties, and tries to exclude rival powers. Self-determination is the idea that peoples have the right to choose their own sovereign allegiance and government. These two concepts can collide head-on. Kissinger's diplomacy examines this clash in the context of the Cold War and its aftermath, and it remains starkly relevant in 2025. During the Cold War, the world was effectively divided into spheres of influence between the superpowers. The United States had its alliances across Western Europe, parts of Asia and other regions, and the Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe and had clients elsewhere. This was a grim reality for those who lived under it. Ask the Hungarians who rebelled in 1956, or the Czechs in 1968, only to be crushed by Soviet tanks enforcing their sphere. But it was tacitly understood by Washington and Moscow as part of the unwritten rules. Each largely refrained from directly challenging the other in their home turf to avoid World War III. Kissinger was deeply familiar with this logic. He dealt with the Soviets on arms control and crises with an understanding of each side's sphere. And indeed, when the Cold War ended, a big question was, would these spheres dissolve into a new era where every nation was truly free to choose its path? Or would new spheres emerge? We got our answer. When Eastern European countries, newly freed from Soviet dominance, asserted their self-determination by seeking to join NATO and the European Union, Russia saw its old sphere shrinking and reacted with alarm. For a while, Russia was too weak to respond, but as it recovered some strength under a strongman leadership, it grew more confrontational. By 2022, this culminated in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an extreme attempt to drag a neighboring country back into its orbit by force. After other means, political pressure, a partial invasion in 2014, hadn't achieved that. Putin basically drew a line. Ukraine must not slip into the Western sphere via NATO EU. It belongs in Russia's. Ukraine, however, through its popular movements and elected governments, has repeatedly signaled its desire for the opposite alignment with the West, or at least not to be subordinated to Moscow. This war thus starkly represents the clash. One side's demand for a sphere versus another people's demand for self-determination. Now consider the Asia-Pacific. China views much of its periphery as within its natural sphere of influence, a view rooted partly in history. As the Middle Kingdom, it once expected deference from neighbors, and partly in security. It doesn't want US bases and alliances encircling it. This manifests most clearly in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. Beijing draws a thick, dashed line around much of the South China Sea, claiming historic rights and treating the area almost as its home waters. This alarms smaller Southeast Asian nations like Vietnam and the Philippines, who have their own claims there, not to mention the interest of the US in keeping those waters international. We've seen Chinese naval buildups and island fortifications, and in response increased US naval patrols asserting freedom of navigation, essentially, a test of will over whose sphere that sea falls into. Similarly with Taiwan, China insists Taiwan is an internal matter, part of its sphere with no foreign interference allowed, whereas the US unofficially protects Taiwan with arms sales and hints of defense, making it part of an American protective sphere of sorts. These overlapping spheres are a dangerous game, like two rival schoolyard gangs claiming the same turf. The people on the ground, whether it's Taiwanese citizens or Filipinos living on contested islands, just want to live in peace with self-determination, but they risk becoming pawns or victims if big power competition escalates. Even the Middle East has seen spheres of influence struggles. During the Cold War, the US and USSR vied for influence through proxies and client states. For instance, Egypt flipped from the Soviet sphere to the American sphere in the 1970s, after Kissinger's diplomacy helped woo Cairo away from Moscow. Today, regional powers assert their own spheres. Iran seeks influence from Iraq to Lebanon to Yemen. Saudi Arabia and its Sunni allies push back to protect their own zone. The devastating war in Yemen, for example, became a battleground for Iranian versus Saudi influence, with local people caught in the middle. These interventions show how quickly the principle of sovereign self-determination can be overridden by greater powers' strategic designs. Kissinger's analyses throughout diplomacy suggest a cold reality. Big powers have always sought spheres of influence. Completely eliminating that impulse is unlikely. The key is how to manage it so it doesn't lead to constant war. He might argue that recognizing another great power's core security interests is part of a successful diplomatic strategy. For instance, the US during the Cuban Missile Crisis implicitly acknowledged the Soviet sphere by later removing missiles from Turkey and promising not to invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviets withdrawing missiles from Cuba. Each side respected the other's vital interests enough to step back from the brink. On the other hand, Kissinger also appreciates the yearning of nations to be free. He himself fled Nazi Germany as a youth and fought in the US Army to liberate Europe. He isn't blind to the moral force of people's wanting self-determination. He just balances it with a dose of Realpolitik when advising how to achieve it gradually without triggering massive conflict. Ultimately, there is no simple formula to resolve this dilemma between power and principle. But history offers hope. Mighty empires often crumble, and people's desire for freedom endures. Diplomacy cannot erase the tension entirely, but it can channel it into peaceful compromises instead of violent confrontations. It means each side curbing its absolute demands, a big power restraining its appetite for control, and a smaller nation sometimes accepting a pragmatic arrangement short of total autonomy. By finding those uneasy but workable compromises, diplomats can prevent a dangerous standoff from exploding. As Kissinger might put it, diplomacy is the art of taming the ambitions of the mighty and tempering the passions of the just so that they meet somewhere short of catastrophe. In a world of spheres and aspirations, mastering that art is our best hope to keep conflict in check. Alliances and alignments, shifting coalitions in a changing world. In the grand chessboard of diplomacy, alliances are one of the key pieces that nations maneuver. Kissinger's history puts a spotlight on alliances, how they form, function, and sometimes fail as crucial factors in war and peace. An alliance is like a contract of mutual insurance. Countries agree to defend each other or act together, hoping to deter enemies and amplify their strength. But alliances can also entangle nations in conflicts they might otherwise avoid, or they can crumble when tested. Understanding the dynamics of alliances in the past can illuminate the reshaping of alliances we see today, from NATO's evolution to the expansion of BRICS and other new partnerships. A vivid historical example of alliance dynamics is pre-World War I Europe. The continent was divided into two rival camps, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, Russia, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. These pacts were intended to provide security. If one nation was attacked, its friends would step in. However, they also created a scenario where a spark could set off a chain reaction, which is exactly what happened in 1914. Austria's conflict with Serbia activated Russian obligations to Serbia, which triggered Germany's pact with Austria, bringing in France and Britain against Germany and so on. It was like a row of dominoes falling. Kissinger describes this as a kind of doomsday machine of alliances once set in motion. Leaders felt they had no choice but to follow the fateful path to war. The lesson is not that alliances are bad per se, but that rigid automatic commitments can reduce flexibility and diplomatic options in a crisis. Contrast that with the alliances after World War II. NATO was formed in 1949 by the US, Canada, and Western European nations as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. NATO's unity and strength arguably prevented the Soviets from attacking Western Europe. The alliance's promise that an attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all made the Kremlin think twice. During the Cold War, NATO and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact glared at each other across the Iron Curtain. But the existence of these blocs may have kept an uneasy peace by making the costs of war unacceptably high. However, alliances must adapt when conditions change. After the Cold War, NATO did not dissolve. Instead, it expanded eastward, accepting as members many countries that had once been Warsaw Pact states or Soviet republics. Those new members joined for their own security, eager to be under NATO's protective umbrella. But from Russia's viewpoint, this expansion felt like a steady encirclement. By the time NATO indicated even Ukraine might one day join, a prospect floated in 2008, Russia was openly alarmed. This backdrop helps explain, though, it doesn't excuse Russia's aggressive stance toward its neighbors. It did not want the world's most powerful military alliance pressing up against its borders. Here we see how one side's pursuit of security can inadvertently provoke insecurity in another. Diplomacy ideally should manage these perceptions, finding ways to reassure Russia about NATO's intentions, while still protecting the right of countries to choose their alliances. Unfortunately, that balance was not well maintained, contributing to the tragic conflict we see today in Ukraine. Alliances in the 21st century are evolving beyond the Old West versus East binary. New coalitions are forming that reflect the shifting distribution of power. A notable development is BRICS, which began as an economic forum, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and is now growing in geopolitical ambition. These countries and others invited to join them represent a large share of the world's population and economy. They band together in part to amplify their voices against what they perceive as Western dominance in global affairs. BRICS nations coordinate on economic policies and sometimes diplomatic positions, seeking a more multipolar order where no single bloc, like the US-led West, calls all the shots. While BRICS is not a military alliance, its members are too geographically and politically diverse for that. Its expansion to include states like Saudi Arabia and Iran shows a desire among many mid-sized powers for alternative alignments. In a way, it's a modern echo of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, but this time with more economic clout behind it. These countries aren't forming an anti-NATO, but they are signaling that international rules shouldn't be set by the West alone. Meanwhile, traditional powers are forging new partnerships tailored to present challenges. The United States has been strengthening security ties in the Indo-Pacific through groupings like the Quad, US, Japan, India, Australia, and AUKUS, a pact where the US and UK assist Australia with nuclear submarine technology and deeper defense cooperation. These are responses to China's rising military power, essentially like-minded nations forming a circle of cooperation to ensure a balance in Asia. China, in turn, has drawn closer to Russia in what they call a no-limits friendship, and both have courted other countries that feel sidelined by the West. In the Middle East, we've seen unusual new alignments as well. For instance, Israel has quietly developed security ties with some Arab states that share its concerns about Iran, and Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia are hedging their bets by engaging not only with the US and Europe, but also with China and Russia. The global picture resembles a kaleidoscope more than a fixed set of two camps. Alignments can shift depending on the issue and interest at hand. Kissinger's writings remind us that alliances are not ends in themselves. They are tools for national security and a stable world order. He admired the deft use of alliances by statesmen like Bismarck, who created a web of treaties in 19th century Europe to isolate rivals and keep peace. He also saw how mismanaged alliances contributed to World War I. The key is flexibility. Nations must be willing to realign when interests change. For example, in the 1970s, the US effectively switched partners by reaching out to Communist China, turning a foe into a tacit ally against the Soviet Union. That move, engineered by Nixon and Kissinger, showed that ideology can take a back seat to strategy. Former enemies became partners because each side gained an advantage against a common rival. It's a classic case of how no friendship or enmity between nations is permanent. What's permanent are interests. So what do these shifting alliances mean for global peace in 2025? On one hand, strong alliances like NATO can deter aggression, as we see in NATO's unified support for its members and even its military aid to non-member Ukraine's defense. On the other hand, the emergence of multiple blocs NATO, a looser China-Russia partnership, an expanded BRICS, and others, means we must be vigilant that the world doesn't split into hostile camps that refuse to talk. The risk is a return to a Cold War-style standoff, or worse, a hot war sparked by a local clash that escalates. The hopeful scenario is that these various alliances and coalitions actually balance each other in a way that no one is reckless enough to start a big war, and that they perhaps even find common ground on global issues. For instance, all powers have an interest in preventing nuclear proliferation and combating climate change. That requires diplomacy across alliances, keeping channels open between rival blocs. In summary, alliances are like the scaffolding of international security. They support stability as long as they're well constructed and there is communication between them. Kissinger would advise today's leaders to maintain ironclad commitments to their core allies, but also to be ready to bend and reconfigure partnerships as interests evolve. And crucially, never let alliance loyalty prevent dialogue with those outside the alliance. After all, the ultimate goal is a world where security is shared, not us versus them, but an all of us working to prevent war. We are not there yet, but understanding the uses and limits of alliances is a step toward that vision. Diplomacy in war and peace, negotiating the end of conflicts. Kissinger's history emphasizes not just how wars are waged, but how they are ended and whether those endings bring lasting peace or sow the seeds of future strife. A clear example is the contrast between the two world wars. After World War I, the victors imposed the Treaty of Versailles on defeated Germany, a peace settlement that punished and humiliated the loser without truly removing its ability to fight again or integrating it back into the community of nations. Germans saw it as unjust. The French felt it wasn't sufficient to secure them, and indeed that flawed treaty left Germany bitter and craving revenge. The result, just 2 decades later, the world plunged into an even more devastating war. By contrast, after World War II, the Allies took a wiser approach. Rather than vengeance, they pursued reconciliation and reconstruction. The United States helped rebuild defeated foes through massive aid and support, notably the Marshall Plan in Europe and a similar rebuilding of Japan. West Germany and Japan emerged as prosperous, stable democracies and, crucially, were welcomed as partners in the new international order instead of being shunned. This inclusive peace made it far less likely that they would turn hostile again. The lesson is powerful. If you want a war to truly end, the peace must be constructive, not punitive. The defeated nation should have a path to restore its dignity and join the global community, or else resentment will fester and lead to another conflict. Fast forward to today's conflicts. Take the Russia-Ukraine war. However, and whenever this war concludes, the nature of its ending will matter immensely for the future of Europe. If the peace terms utterly humiliate one side, that side may nurse grudges and plot a comeback in years to come. On the other hand, if key issues are left unresolved, the conflict could simply pause and then reignite. Diplomacy will eventually have to strike a balance. Ukraine must emerge secure and truly sovereign, and Russian aggression must not be rewarded. Yet Russia as a nation will remain a neighbor in the region, and for peace to last, it will need some face-saving way to accept the outcome. It's a daunting challenge, especially amid the pain and anger of war. But history suggests that only an agreement seen as at least tolerable by both peoples can hold. It might involve tough compromises, perhaps about local autonomy or long-term neutrality for Ukraine. And it certainly will require international support to rebuild trust. The point is, a sustainable peace cannot be one side's diktat. It has to address the fundamental needs of both, much as the post-1945 settlement did, by rebuilding former enemies into allies. Now consider the Israel-Palestine conflict, exemplified by the recent Israel-Gaza crisis. This is a very different kind of struggle, a protracted, deeply emotional conflict between two peoples over the same land. But the principle for ending it is similar. Any lasting peace would need to ensure Israelis feel secure in their state, and Palestinians finally achieve their long-denied statehood and dignity. Decades of fighting, terror, and tragedy have shown that neither side can eliminate the other's presence or aspirations. Diplomatic efforts in the past, like the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, sketched a two-state solution precisely because it offers a framework where both sides win something. Israel gets lasting recognition and peace, Palestinians get independence. That dream has stalled and violence has flared up again, as it did tragically in Gaza in 2023. Kissinger's approach, incremental deals, building trust step by step, might yet be a way forward. Perhaps initial agreements on smaller issues, ceasefires, humanitarian measures, economic cooperation, can lay groundwork for tackling the big political questions: borders, Jerusalem, refugees. It will take courageous leadership and outside mediation, but ultimately, as with other wars, this conflict will end at a negotiating table, not on a battlefield. The sooner that day comes, the fewer families will mourn lost loved ones on both sides. A crucial insight here is that nearly every war, however ferocious, eventually ends with diplomacy. The only question is how much suffering is endured before the parties talk. Even during active conflicts, channels of communication often persist. We saw that in the Ukraine war, where negotiations, mediated by Turkey and the UN, allowed the export of grain to feed the world, despite the fighting a small diplomatic breakthrough amid war. Such efforts show that adversaries can find common interest even in conflict, in this case, avoiding famine and economic collapse. It's a reminder that dialogue need not wait until the last gun falls silent. It can save lives even in wartime and pave the way for a broader peace. Kissinger's chronicle drives home the idea that ending wars demands both realism and vision. Realism to accept what is achievable, that each side may only get part of what it wants, and vision to imagine former enemies living side by side in a new peace. After the carnage of war, extending an open hand to an adversary requires immense emotional strength, but it has been done before and can be done again. The final settlements of great conflicts are the foundations of the next era of international relations. If crafted wisely, they can usher in decades of stability. If crafted poorly, they guarantee future nightmares. This is why the art of negotiation in war and peace is literally life-saving. In a volatile world, remembering these lessons is essential. As soon as a door opens to talk instead of fight, we must walk through it, for the sake of all who yearn for peace after the storm. Cold War lessons, deterrence, dialogue, and détente in a new era. The Cold War, circa 1947-1991, was a conflict unlike any before it, a prolonged standoff between nuclear-armed superpowers. It never erupted into direct war between the US and USSR, and that was no accident. Through perilous trial and error, both sides learned key lessons about deterrence, preventing war through the threat of overwhelming retaliation, communication, maintaining clear channels to avoid misunderstandings, and the value of reducing tensions, détente. These lessons remain highly relevant as we face renewed great power rivalries in 2025. The first lesson was the grim logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD. Once both the United States and Soviet Union had nuclear weapons capable of annihilating each other, and the world of direct war became unthinkable. It would have no victors, only survivors, if that. This realization enforced a certain caution. Neither Washington nor Moscow wanted to push the other too far. Crises had to be managed so they didn't spiral. The most dangerous moment, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, taught this vividly. When the USSR placed nuclear missiles in Cuba and the US discovered them, the two superpowers came eyeball to eyeball at the brink of nuclear war. In the end, catastrophe was averted because both President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev were willing to communicate and compromise. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove US missiles from Turkey, which threatened the USSR, and Khrushchev agreed to pull Soviet missiles out of Cuba. The public only saw that the Soviets blinked, but behind the scenes each side gave something. The crisis led to a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, so leaders could talk instantly during emergencies. The lesson for today is that even in extreme rivalry, clear communication and offering face-saving options to your adversary are essential to avoid catastrophe. Another Cold War lesson was the importance of sustained dialogue and arms control. Recognizing that an unchecked arms race and constant paranoia were recipes for disaster, the superpowers gradually sought to put guardrails on their competition. They signed treaties limiting certain nuclear weapons, like the SALT agreements and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, to reduce the chance of miscalculation. They also engaged in regular summits. Even at the height of tensions, American and Soviet diplomats were talking negotiating prisoner exchanges, setting rules for military encounters, and finding small areas of cooperation, for instance, working together to eradicate smallpox. This didn't mean they trusted each other, it meant they were wise enough to manage their distrust. By the 1970s, détente emerged, a deliberate thawing of relations. Under President Richard Nixon and advisor Kissinger, the US opened dialogue with Moscow and, in a masterstroke of diplomacy, also with Communist China, which had been estranged from the USSR. This triangular diplomacy, the US balancing relationships with both communist giants, put pressure on the USSR to be more accommodating and helped ease global tensions. For our time, the takeaway is that channels of engagement must remain open. When nations stop talking, misunderstandings multiply. In today's US-China tensions, for example, maintaining military hotlines and diplomatic contacts can prevent an incident, say a collision of warships in the South China Sea, from blowing up. Similarly, despite the war in Ukraine, it's crucial that Washington and Moscow continue some form of communication on arms control, on avoiding direct clashes rather than cutting all ties. History shows that even at dagger's point, dialogue is not a concession, it's a tool of survival. The Cold War also illustrates how understanding your adversary's thinking can be as important as your own strength. American and Soviet leaders who grasped each other's motives could make smarter decisions. For instance, US strategist George Kennan advocated containment of the Soviet Union, firmly countering Soviet expansion, but he also cautioned against demonizing the Soviets to the point of no return. Ultimately, the Cold War ended not through an apocalyptic showdown, but through internal changes in the Soviet Union and a willingness of leaders to engage. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, and his outreach to the West met with receptive partners in leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. In the late 1980s, Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated significant nuclear arms reductions, the INF Treaty, for example, and built a personal rapport that helped dissipate decades of hostility. Reagan, once a hardline anti-communist, came to see Gorbachev as a partner for peace and famously declared, "This Cold War must end." The Berlin Wall fell not to a barrage of artillery, but to the pressure of people yearning for freedom and a Kremlin that chose not to shoot. The lesson here is twofold. Keep an open mind that rivals can change, and don't underestimate the power of ideals. While military strength and deterrence kept the peace, the appeal of a better life and human rights ultimately led millions in the Soviet bloc to push for change. Today's geopolitical rivalries, whether we label the US and China as a new Cold War or not, share some features with the old Cold War, along with new twists. Nuclear deterrence still prevents direct great power conflict. Russia's nuclear arsenal is a major reason NATO hasn't intervened directly in Ukraine, and China's growing arsenal shapes US strategy in Asia. Economic and technological interdependence, however, makes this era different. The US and China are trading partners even as they compete, and cyber warfare and AI add new dimensions to the rivalry. Still, the Cold War's lessons urge us not to slide into panic or fatalism when tensions rise, but to actively manage those tensions. That means investing in diplomacy as heavily as we invest in defense. It means striking agreements where possible, perhaps new cyber or space treaties to prevent accidents and arms races in emerging domains. It means remembering the value of détente, finding pockets of common interest, like climate change mitigation or pandemic response today, where cooperation with rivals is mutually beneficial despite other disagreements. Most importantly, the Cold War's peaceful conclusion is a reminder that seemingly inexorable conflicts can find surprising resolutions. Few in the 1950s would have predicted the Soviet Union would dissolve without World War III, but it did. It happened because both pressure and patience were applied. Pressure in the form of firm containment and the strength of democratic ideals, patience in allowing the Soviet system's flaws to lead to its own transformation. While today's situations differ, the ethos we should carry forward is the same. Be strong and vigilant, but also be ready to engage and seek change through dialogue. As Kissinger might advise leaders now, don't throw away the guardrails built during the Cold War, things like arms control agreements, crisis hotlines, and regular summits. Instead, rebuild and update them for the 21st century. In short, the Cold War's big lesson is that the balance of terror can be managed by a balance of reason. Humanity avoided nuclear holocaust because reason prevailed barely in moments of crisis. In our current rivalries, we must not rely on luck. We must deliberately cultivate communication, empathy, and foresight. The tools and approaches that kept the peace then deterrence combined with détente are still among the best guides we have to prevent a major power war in the future. The global order at a crossroads, a new concert of powers. Considering all these themes, the balance of power, sovereignty, shifting alliances, and so on, we arrive at a fundamental question. What kind of world order will emerge in the 21st century? The old Cold War bipolar order is gone, and the brief period of uncontested American dominance after 1990 has faded. We are now in a fluid era with multiple centers of power. The global system is at a crossroads. It could devolve into chaotic competition, or it could be reimagined into a more cooperative equilibrium. In Kissinger's terms, we need to ask whether today's great powers can form something akin to a concert of powers, an understanding to keep the peace, or whether we will stumble into rivalry and conflict as in the lead-up to World War I. There are signs pointing in both directions. On one hand, the shared challenges of our time almost beg for a cooperative approach. Issues like climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, and economic instability do not respect national borders. Forums like the G20, which brings together established and emerging powers, have had some success in coordinating global economic responses, such as during the 2008 financial crisis. Nearly every country signed on to the Paris Agreement on climate, acknowledging a common threat. These examples show that a sense of collective interest can prevail, at least in specific areas. One could imagine an evolving international system where major powers, despite their rivalries, regularly consult and compromise to tackle global problems, effectively extending the concept of the 19th century concert of Europe to the whole world. In such a scenario, the United States, China, Europe, the EU, Russia, India, and others would all have a seat at the table when big decisions are made, and each would have a stake in maintaining stability. On the other hand, the reality of recent years has been rocky. Resurgent nationalism and great power ambition often pull against global cooperation. Russia's war in Ukraine blatantly violated the post-1945 norm against conquering territory by force, undermining international law. US-China strategic distrust has grown, with trade wars, tech decoupling, and military posturing around Taiwan. Many countries in the global south feel caught in between, preferring a truly multipolar world where their voices are heard rather than choosing sides. This fragmentation could harden into blocks, with each pursuing its own interests, a recipe for tension and miscalculation. A crucial ingredient for a stable order is what Kissinger calls legitimacy, a broad acceptance of the rules by the major players. The current international system, with the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so forth, was largely shaped in 1945 when the victors of World War II set it up. It enshrined liberal principles and US leadership. While that system brought many benefits, decades of relative great power peace and unprecedented global economic growth, today's rising powers and many developing nations feel it doesn't fully reflect them. They point out, for instance, that the UN Security Council still has no permanent member from Africa or Latin America, and that global financial rules were written primarily by the West. Whether one agrees or not, the perception of illegitimacy fuels countries to form new groupings, like BRICS, or to defy Western-led initiatives. To renew legitimacy, reforms may be needed. International institutions might be updated to give emerging powers more influence, and global norms must be hashed out in a truly inclusive way. A new understanding, perhaps via major power summits or new forums, may be required, so that all the key players feel invested in the international order, not intent on undermining it. Kissinger noted at the end of diplomacy that after the Cold War, the United States faced an unprecedented situation of dominance, and the challenge would be to integrate American power into a world with multiple perspectives. In 2025, that observation rings true, not just for America, but for every great power. Each must learn to navigate a pluralistic world. China, for example, seeks greater influence commensurate with its power. It will need to show it can exercise that influence responsibly, respecting others' interests if it wants to be seen as a legitimate leader. Europe, for its part, champions rules and human rights, and must continue to do so while also engaging respectfully with those who have different systems. Emerging giants like India, Brazil, and others are asserting their ideas such as non-interference in domestic affairs and equitable development, and will demand to have those ideas considered in global decision-making. At this crossroads, one can almost sense history repeating itself in new form. Just as the Congress of Vienna in 1815 brought rival empires together to agree on rules after the Napoleonic Wars, we may be due for a 21st century equivalent, not a single conference, but a process of major powers negotiating a shared vision for maintaining peace and prosperity. Perhaps it will come through strengthening and reforming the United Nations, or through ad hoc coalitions and dialogues like the G20 or future summits that include both Western and non-Western powers. The key will be inclusivity and mutual respect. If any major player feels permanently marginalized or disrespected, the system will suffer and instability will grow. The stakes could not be higher. In an age of nuclear weapons and hyper-connected economies, a breakdown of world order would be catastrophic. A direct war between superpowers could be civilization ending, and even short of that, decoupling into hostile economic blocs would impoverish many and hamper responses to global crises. Conversely, a working concert of powers where competition exists but is managed, and cooperation is routine on shared interests, could usher in an era of unprecedented problem-solving and peace. It wouldn't mean an end to disagreements, but it would mean mechanisms to prevent disagreements from turning violent. It might not be a warm, fuzzy global harmony, but it could be a pragmatic arrangement to avoid the worst outcomes. As citizens and observers, we should watch for signs of which way the world is leaning. Do we see more moments like the US and China coordinating at a climate summit or easing trade frictions? Or do we see more rhetorical warfare and zero-sum behavior? The answers will shape the world our children inherit. Kissinger's work reminds us that world order is not automatic. It is crafted or broken by the decisions of leaders. We are, in a sense, all passengers on the same ship. The great powers are its crew. If they quarrel endlessly on the bridge, the ship could hit an iceberg. But if they can chart a common course, arguing at times, but ultimately agreeing on core directions, we might navigate this century's perils safely. The opportunity is there, as is the danger. The coming years will reveal whether our leaders can heed the lessons of history and steer toward a stable, shared global order, or whether they drift into a tempest of their own making. We can only hope wisdom prevails at this historic crossroads. Diplomacy as leadership, the human element in statecraft. Amid all the grand forces of history, people, individual leaders, and negotiators make an enormous difference. Kissinger's diplomacy often highlights how the personality and choices of key statesmen shaped outcomes. Ultimately, diplomacy is an art practiced by human beings. Qualities like wisdom, courage, patience, and empathy, or the lack thereof in leaders, can steer nations toward war or peace. Consider a few examples. In the 19th century, Prince Metternich of Austria and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany were towering diplomats who mastered the balance of power through sheer personal skill. Metternich, after the Napoleonic Wars, helped design a stable order in Europe by convincing adversaries to compromise and by restraining the victors from punishing France too severely. Bismarck, after unifying Germany through wars, spent the next 2 decades preserving peace by juggling alliances and managing crises with cool pragmatism. These men were not saints, they acted in their nation's interests, but their diplomatic savvy prevented larger conflagrations. On the flip side, less adept leadership after Bismarck, like the impulsive Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany, contributed to miscalculations that led to World War I. Kissinger uses such contrasts to show that individual statesmanship matters. The right leader at the right time can avert disaster, while a reckless one can unleash it. Jump to more recent times. In the 1970s, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made a courageous personal decision that changed the course of Middle East history. He traveled to Jerusalem in 1977 to speak directly to the Israeli Knesset, essentially extending a hand of peace to a longtime enemy. That act, born of Sadat's vision and boldness, paved the way for the Camp David Accords and the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty, a peace that has held ever since. It required equal courage from Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and skillful mediation by US President Jimmy Carter to reciprocate by returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. These were profoundly personal gambles. Both Sadat and Begin faced fierce criticism at home. Sadat ultimately paid with his life, assassinated by extremists, but his legacy shows how one leader's initiative and willingness to break the cycle of hatred can change the trajectory for millions. Another example, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader in the 1980s, whose personal convictions and openness helped end the Cold War peacefully. Gorbachev had the imagination to realize that the East-West confrontation was a dead end. He initiated reforms at home and reached out abroad. In summit meetings with US President Ronald Reagan, Gorbachev's sincerity and Reagan's willingness to engage led to breakthrough agreements slashing nuclear arsenals. It's often noted that if someone else had led the Soviet Union a hardliner without Gorbachev's vision, the Cold War might have dragged on longer or ended with bloodshed. Gorbachev's humane approach and Reagan's response demonstrated how empathy and trust at the highest level can unlock solutions that rigid ideology and hostility never would. What traits do these effective diplomatic leaders share? Courage is one, the bravery to go against the prevailing currents of fear or hatred among their own people. It took courage for Sadat to visit Israel, for Gorbachev to let Eastern Europe go free, for Nixon, coached by Kissinger, to shake hands with Mao in Beijing. They were willing to take risks and face backlash because they believed the strategic prize peace or a stronger long-term position was worth it. Another trait is vision, the ability to imagine a different future and articulate it. Visionary leaders can paint a picture of peace that inspires others to follow, rather than remain stuck in a mindset of permanent conflict. Empathy and insight are also crucial. The best diplomats truly try to understand their adversaries' motivations and fears. By doing so, they can find negotiating angles others miss. For instance, American negotiators in the 1960s who grasped Soviet insecurities helped craft arms control deals that addressed those fears. A diplomat who senses when an opponent needs a face-saving compromise can offer it and thus clinch an agreement. We see this even in everyday life. A bit of understanding can resolve what stubborn pride would stalemate. Effective leaders in diplomacy also know the value of personal relationships. Kissinger himself, during his secret negotiations with China and his Middle East shuttle diplomacy, cultivated personal rapport with counterparts like Zhou Enlai in Beijing and President Sadat in Cairo. Such trust, even if limited, can smooth over a lot of interstate suspicion. When leaders respect each other, they can speak more frankly and work through problems faster. Think of the friendship that developed between France's President Charles de Gaulle and West Germany's Chancellor Konrad Adenauer after World War II. Their bond symbolized reconciliation between their nations. At times, just a face-to-face meeting can humanize the enemy and open eyes. Many historians believe that the warm rapport between Reagan and Gorbachev helped them overcome decades of Cold War animosity and surprise, even their own advisors, with how far cooperation could go. Of course, leaders are human and fallible. Emotional intelligence is key, the ability to control one's temper and avoid needless insults. A small gaffe or slight can derail talks. Not every leader possesses this. Some get swept up in nationalist fervor or ego and cannot compromise or apologize even when it's necessary. Diplomacy requires a certain humility, recognizing that one's own side may not get everything it wants, and that the other side has legitimate interests too. Leaders who embrace that mindset can find solutions that rigid, prideful figures never can. Ultimately, Kissinger's narrative teaches that the trajectory of world affairs can hinge on a single meeting, a single act of courage, or a single persuasive voice in a council chamber. It reminds us that history is not only driven by impersonal forces, it is written by individuals making choices. That means there's always the possibility for a creative, brave decision to change the course of events. As we look to our current and future leaders, we should hope they have the courage of a Sadat, the foresight of a Gorbachev, and the steady patience of a Metternich. And where they lack these qualities, perhaps they can find wise counselors to guide them. In the end, even the best principles of statecraft, balance of power, deterrence, dialogue, must be put into action by human hands. With enlightened leadership, those principles can translate into policies that avert war and build peace. Without such leadership, even the soundest strategies will falter. The fate of peace often comes down to a few people in a room making hard choices. Let those be people of character and insight. Conclusion: navigating a volatile world with wisdom and courage. As we conclude this journey through Henry Kissinger's diplomacy and our current global challenges, several powerful lessons shine through. History's grand sweep teaches us that while technology and circumstances change, the fundamental dynamics of international relations, power, fear, ambition, and hope remain. Yet we are not passive prisoners of these forces. The past offers guidance to shape the future. One key lesson is that balance and moderation are essential. Whether it's balancing power with power, balancing national interest with moral ideals, or balancing justice with mercy in a peace settlement, moderation and equilibrium keep catastrophe at bay. Whenever the balance was lost, when one nation sought absolute dominance, or one idea was pushed with blind zeal, disaster followed. The clear message for today's leaders is to seek balance in their policies, build strength, yes, but also restraint, uphold principles, but also be willing to compromise. Grand visions must be leavened with practical realities. Another lesson is the primacy of diplomacy itself, talking, listening, negotiating. It sounds simple, almost cliché, but consider the alternative. Each time diplomacy fails, cities burn and innocents suffer. We've seen it in Ukraine's shattered towns, in Gaza's rubble, in the bitter aftermath of wars throughout history. Diplomacy is difficult, frustrating, and often slow. It requires imagination to see through an adversary's eyes, and grit to sit at the table with those you distrust. But it is the tool that has saved humanity time and again from the brink. Kissinger's historical accounts make clear that even adversaries as staunch as the US and Soviet Union found ways to coexist without blowing up the world, not because they agreed, but because they recognized the necessity to coexist. In our volatile world, doubling down on diplomacy, investing in skilled envoys, maintaining dialogue even with foes, Pushing for negotiations when conflicts seem intractable is not a sign of weakness, but of civilization. It shows we prefer the hard work of peace over the easy descent into war. We also learned that leadership matters immensely. In times of crisis, the character and choices of individuals, presidents, prime ministers, generals, but also activists and diplomats can tip the scales between disaster and peace. We will need leaders who are students of history so they don't repeat old mistakes. We will need them to be emotionally intelligent so they can calm fears and build trust even with opponents. And we will need them to have moral courage, the bravery to sign a peace agreement that may be unpopular in the moment, the courage to resist calls for total victory if compromise can save lives. In a world of loud voices and rising passions, such courage can be rare, but history shows it does emerge when most needed. Think of Nelson Mandela negotiating the end of apartheid, or the leaders who built the European Union out of the ashes of war. They faced enormous skepticism, yet they forged a new path. Their courage to forgive and to cooperate transformed enemies into partners. What about the rest of us? Not everyone can be a statesman, but each of us is a citizen of a nation and of the world. We navigate a daily flood of information that tries to shape how we see the other, another country or people. One day the narrative paints them as monsters, another day perhaps as allies. To navigate this, we should cultivate a diplomatic mindset in our own lives. That means staying informed from multiple perspectives, not just our own nation's echo chamber. It means practicing empathy, asking, why does the other side see things that way, rather than only feeding our own anger? It means supporting dialogue and exchange, people-to-people contacts, educational and cultural links, city partnerships. In a globalized era, ordinary people can build bridges across divides, making it harder for their leaders to demonize entire populations. Public opinion matters. If citizens value peace and understanding, politicians are more likely to seek compromise. If citizens cheer only for hardline stances, even well-intentioned leaders will feel constrained. So we all have a role, to reward those who choose diplomacy and to remain vigilant against the allure of simplistic, aggressive solutions. In a world still fraught with nuclear weapons, cultural misunderstandings, and transnational threats, fear is natural. It's easy to fall into despair and think war is inevitable or that ordinary people have no say. But Kissinger's odyssey through diplomatic history tells a different story. Time and again, people have chosen cooperation over conflict and pulled back from the abyss. It often happened after much suffering, yes, but it did happen. And each time, it was because individuals, both leaders and citizens, pushed for a better way. They refused to accept that cruelty or chaos were inevitable. They brokered peace, rebuilt trust, and established new rules for a new era. As we navigate our current crises, be it the standoff in Eastern Europe, the humanitarian tragedy in the Middle East, or the strategic rivalry in Asia, we should remember that this is not the first time the world has seemed on the brink. Our predecessors faced down seemingly hopeless conflicts and found paths forward. We can draw strength from their legacy. The balance of power can be adjusted peacefully if we have dialogue. The wounds of war can heal if a just peace is pursued with empathy for all involved. New adversaries don't have to remain enemies forever. Yesterday's foe can be tomorrow's partner, as history has shown in relationships from the US and Japan to France and Germany. In the final analysis, Kissinger's diplomacy offers not a rigid formula, but a guiding light. It urges us to understand the past, to be sober about human nature, but never cynical about our capacity to learn and improve. It counsels us to use power, but to legitimize it with fairness, to champion our values, but to implement them with tact, and above all, to keep talking, especially when it's hardest, for that's when diplomacy is needed most. In a world of uncertainty, one thing is certain. The more we practice the art of restraining power and elevating reason, the brighter the prospects for peace. The pen can still triumph over the sword if we so choose.